I know there are questions in the audience, so I'm going to ask you to pose them to all three of the panel members. John is known as Mr. Bank, primarily because he's been counsel to several Canadian and international entities that have established a banking presence in Canada. He's a partner at Blake, Cassels and Graydon, and I'm just going to ask him to begin his remarks.
Okay, thank you. I want to just talk on a very specific aspect of this subject, and that is retail banking. And really, the question is, from a Canadian policy standpoint, does not a significant portion of the population have an entitlement to receive financial service products in accordance with their religious beliefs? And should we have a regulatory regime, should the products not be delivered by entities that are regulated? I think that we're working certainly to have some fully Sharia-compliant banks in Canada, and that there are a number of issues. I've heard some of our political representatives today sound very encouraging, very positive. I think that if they could be a lot more helpful in making this happen, if they really chose to. The approach we're taking is that these banks really will be set up without any assistance, the way the FSA in the UK, for example, assisted some of the banks there that wanted to do Sharia-compliant banking. So I think we can do it without government assistance, but it would certainly be consistent with the political statements to encourage this kind of financing in Canada if we had some help on that. There are a lot of issues that we have to reconcile to bring a Sharia-compliant bank into Canada. And we've looked at the question whether a bank has the power to deal in these instruments. And I'm satisfied that a Canadian bank has the power to deal in the full range of Islamic products. I think in the final analysis, all these products are financial intermediary products, and the essence of our financial system is to put together the people with surplus funds with the people who have a need for the funds. So I think if we look at it from a substantive standpoint, this is all compatible. And indeed, some of our Canadian banks engage in some of these transactions today. They don't bring the profile because it's such a small portion of the balance sheet. So I think we're through the fundamental issue of powers. The problems where we have to reconcile is are things. It's the word interest. The word interest, of course, is a very prohibitive word for the Islamic banks, and yet it's at the essence of so many of our bank statements, bank returns, tax returns, and that's the real challenge that we're working with. Also, there are challenges in that the banks are limited as to the equity positions they can take. They're limited as to the positions they can have in securities. They're limited as to what they can have in real estate. So again, we as long as everyone agrees that in substance these are financing transactions, not transactions where the bank's acting as principal and taking a risk that the asset the bank is buying at the request of the customer will be devalued, we can work this out. In another issue we're dealing with is the capital issue. Of course, the Western banks, they all operate on the Basel risk-based approach, and you analyze the value of the covenant. You analyze the value of the promise of the debtor to repay the money. Well, as you all know, and with many of the Islamic financing devices, they're basically non-recourse. That if the project is not successful, then there will not necessarily be a repayment to the bank. So what's the appropriate capital structure for a risk-based approach, which is what we have in Canada, when you don't have a covenant? Now, I think that we do have a lot of experience in this. We've done a lot of non-recourse financings in Canada. Many of the oil and gas projects that are done out west are non-recourse. So my position is there's nothing novel here, that the Canadian banks for years have been doing non-recourse financing, and we know how to allocate capital to those financing. So there's nothing different here. There are other issues that we're dealing with, and again, I think they're all we can handle them. The question really is, can we get some help to make them easier? For example, any bank has to enter into an agreement with the Bank of Canada, which is the lender of last resort. It's mandatory. That's what our laws say. But the agreement with the Bank of Canada, it's in a very, very rigid form, and the bank has to agree to pay interest on the loans. So it's, we're negotiating with the Bank of Canada to have a different form for a Sharia-compliant bank, so that they get the Bank of Canada gets what it wants, but the bank can make the promise. CDIC, we've dealt with CDIC, and CDIC is taking the same approach as the FDIC, which is the principal has to be guaranteed. If it's guaranteed, then CDIC will insure it. But of course, that causes problems with some of the Mudaraba investments where the principal is not guaranteed. There are securities issues that we're working out because in some ways, for example, the unrestricted Tier 1 Mudaraba really can look like a mutual fund, which is not intended to do. There's a partnership issue because Canadian banks are not generally allowed to engage in general partnerships. We are managing that issue. The tax is the hardest issue to manage. Once again, because our tax system says you can deduct interest. So when a depositor gives the bank money and the bank lends it on, the bank can deduct the interest that it pays the depositor. But our tax system is so formalistic rather than substantive that if you don't use the word interest, the tax authorities say, well, it's not interest, it's a profit participation, and the banks can't deduct it. So we're working, and here we've been working with some of the Sharia scholars to try to find a compromise between what the tax system requires and what the Sharia principles will allow. Those are really the main issues. I think the key point is this is all doable, and that we can have banks that will deliver products. And again, we can do this in a very diverse way to meet the needs of other religious groups. So it can be done. We're working towards completion, but certainly if the political will to make Toronto, Ontario, an Islamic capital that we hear is truly there, then we could certainly use some help especially on the tax standpoint. Thank you.
All right, we're going to open up the floor for questions, and I believe the person in the white cap had one. If you could introduce yourself again, briefly.
My name is Adam Isa. I am the president, founder, and Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center, one of the centers here in Toronto. And my question is, before I go my question, actually, I very welcome the last comment is said by the effort going on for the Canadian government to give us in the future alternative arrangement. And I think as a leader of my community as well as someone who also specializes in the Sharia, we would work very hard to make Canada a better place for our business, for all. And my question going back to the Imam Habib and relating the musharaka as well as the murabaha, both cases. And here the differences between the riba or the interest, which is not allowed in Islam, and the permitted business